Northern Ireland's first same-sex religious wedding, which was made possible as a result of the change to marriage equality legislation. Harbour Faith Community had previously campaigned for same-sex marriage, or as we like to call it here, marriage, in Northern Ireland. He's married with himself, with 3 children. So Steve, we're really delighted you could take some time out to speak with us today, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
And I just want to remind everyone, sorry, before Steve starts, that we're recording the sermon. I want to reassure everyone that only Steve's image will be recorded, but all the audio is being recorded. So just if you ask a question, it'll go on the recording.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And it is genuinely a joy to be here with all of you guys. The texts, we tend to follow the lectionary at Harbour, and I'm sure you know the lectionary is just a set of readings throughout the year. And the readings at this point in time obviously are around Easter, the crucifixion, the events leading up to the crucifixion, and right now we're in that post-resurrection sets of narratives. So today the text is Doubting Thomas, actually, so-called Doubting Thomas. And I'm not going to talk specifically about that, although that'll be in focus. What I'm going to do instead is just look for patterns. I like looking for patterns of things. You have to take a step back, zoom out, and try and see things that are being repeated over and over. But just before that, there is this conversation that Jesus has with his disciples who are anxious because they know that Jesus is going to the cross. They know that he's going to Jerusalem. They know that he's going to stir up trouble, as is Jesus' wont. But this time it's during Passover. The Romans are in town. They know what happens to people who are seen as insurgents. And so they can see this. They've seen this movie before. They can see where this is heading. And they're not really happy because, you know, Jesus, as a historical figure, has now attracted a following. Some of his teachings are becoming quite popular. At one point, they had actually tried to make Jesus king, physically make him king then and there, and Jesus had to walk away from that. And now he's walking towards essentially a death sentence. And at one point, Peter actually tries to prevent Jesus, steps in his way and says, never, never, don't, you know, I'm not going to let you go. And Jesus has to rebuke him. But there's this thing that Jesus says to try and calm his disciples down earlier on. And he says to them, it's better for you that I go. So they're all trying to hang on to him desperately, trying to keep him for themselves, trying to protect him. I mean, Peter literally pulls a sword at one point, willing to turn to violence. They are trying to defend their leader. But Jesus is saying, actually, you're missing the point. I need to go. And actually, it's better if I do go. And that's never really explained why. And I think as we look now at the post-Easter stories, we can start to see why, because a series of events start to happen, which are really, really telling. And I think to understand them, the first thing we have to understand is the difference between Jesus and Christ. We're so used to saying Jesus Christ as though Christ were Jesus' surname. Where in fact, Christ is, it's a complicated and a complex word. It comes from the Greek, which means to soak or to saturate. If you go further back into the Hebrew, it has this meaning of Messiah around it, but essentially it refers to that expression of God, which has always been and is always in and through all of creation. The Christ soakness, if you like, the saturation of all that we see, or another word might be anointing is another way of talking about it. It's that presence of God that's always been there for anyone to engage with if they want to. And Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of that expression of God, therefore is called Jesus Christ. But Jesus' actual surname was probably Bar Joseph, given that Joseph was his dad. And Jesus itself is just a common name, more akin to Joshua, really, than anything else. So anyway, we have to understand the Christness that's going on here, because in letting go of Jesus, the historical flesh and blood Jesus right in front of them, the disciples could actually grab onto Christ. And the thing about Christ is Christ's everywhere and through all things and in all things, whereas Jesus was only located in that space and time directly in front of them. So the absence of Jesus would mean the ever-increasing presence of Christ, if the disciples are willing to see it and recognize it. And there's the rub. And this is where I think the resurrection stories bring us. If you notice all the encounters after the resurrection that the disciples and other followers start to have with Jesus, there's always this kind of problem of recognition. They don't recognize Jesus at first in almost all the stories, but then they come to see Christ in the person they're talking to. But there's always this kind of process. If you think about Mary, she initially is talking to who she thinks is the gardener at the tomb. We're told that she thought it was the gardener, and it's not until Jesus says, Mary, that she recognizes Christ. She starts to move from Jesus to Christ. On the road to Emmaus, which is another post-resurrection story, it's these two followers, these two disciples, more peripheral disciples really than the 12 main ones, and they're talking about Jesus, and they encounter their stranger who walks with them for ages and goes to their house and has a meal with them, and they don't recognize until Jesus breaks bread. And then we're told suddenly they see Christ. It's the same with Thomas and the other disciples. You know, it's not just Thomas who needs to see the scars. The other disciples, we're told, also are shown the scars, and then they recognize this person, this stranger in their midst, was in fact Christ. The fourth story, the stranger on the beach, I don't know if you know this one, we're told Jesus appears when the disciples, Peter and some of his close compatriots, have gone out fishing. Now remember, these people are fishermen. So that means they've gone back to work. That means they've left the journey, the calling of a disciple really to a rabbi, and are going back to what they knew best, fishing. Of course, they don't catch anything. They seem to never have any luck, these disciples. And there's this figure appears on the beach, and he calls out to them, and they don't recognize him. He says, have you caught anything? And they're like, no. And he's like, try the other side. They throw the net over, pull it in, and it's full of fish. And suddenly it twigs. That's Christ. And so the stranger becomes Christ on the beach. In all four of those encounters that are very colorful, visceral stories, you see a figure who at first isn't Christ, but then becomes Christ through recognition from the disciples. And each time, the recognition is triggered by something familiar, just a small something that grabs attention. For Mary, it's Jesus saying, Mary, speaking her name in that familiar tone that she recognizes. For Thomas and the other disciples, it's the scars. They remember that was their last known configuration with Jesus, his woundedness, and they recognize that. On the road to Emmaus, it's the breaking of bread that triggers the disciples. That's what Jesus did. It's on the beach. It's the cast your nets and pull in, which reminds the disciples of that very first day that they first met. And so it's like the disciples are encountering memories or echoes of the past, and they are recognizing Christ, given enough time to do so. But here's the interesting thing, at least for me, and for some people, this is maybe going a bit too complex, and Richard Rohr talks about this, and he points out that if you take, for example, the gardener who Mary talks to, Richard Rohr says you need to understand that is the gardener. The person Mary's talking to is the gardener. She just recognizes Christ in the gardener, and so ends up having a conversation with Jesus through the gardener. The stranger on the road to Emmaus is the stranger on the road to Emmaus. He's a stranger, but somehow Christ is portrayed through the stranger, and the other two disciples see it. The stranger on the beach, and so on and so on. They're all given insights, small reminders of the story of Christ, of the story they had been a part of up until that point, and they are all suddenly brought into the presence. Because we have to remember that the resurrection is not the same as a resuscitation. It's not that Jesus in his flesh and blood form was resuscitated, as in coming back to the life in the way that Lazarus, for example, was. Because Lazarus, of course, went on to die a natural death later on, presumably. Jesus isn't resuscitated, he's resurrected. In other words, becomes a new expression of himself in a way that doesn't eventually die again, in the sense that death is conquered. And that is what we are calling Christ, I think. I think that's what the disciples are suddenly starting to see, because whereas before they could only see Jesus in front of them, now they were seeing Christ everywhere and in everyone. One by one, they were starting to see. And all they needed to see Christ was a familiar something, a name, an event that happened, a familiar sound, and then they go, there's Christ. And I wonder, is that actually the point? That the invitation to us is to do exactly the same here and now, to see each other, to see strangers, to see people who are just people until we say to them, that's Christ. The old-fashioned word for this, of course, is christening. That's what it means to christen something. It means to infer Christ upon something or someone, to recognize the divinity in them. What's, I think, important here to note as well is that actually only a small amount of faith is needed to do this. See, Thomas, when he recognizes Christ, he has Jesus say to him, "Blessed are you, Thomas, because you've had something that's caught your attention and you've seen. So blessed are you because you've seen and believed. But even more blessed are those who don't see and yet still come to that faith in Christ." So even if you aren't given that clue, like a physical auditory sound, Mary, your name being spoken, or we obviously weren't there present with Jesus, so we don't have those historical clues that they had, but we can still do the same thing. We can still see what they saw if we want, if we're willing. And even more blessed are we if we do that. So Jesus says to Thomas. And what's really, really fascinating here is I think that when Jesus earlier on in the Gospels talked about faith the size of a mustard seed, it's that amazing story that we all like to tell kids in Sunday school. But no one really pushes the boat out on that story, because every time I hear that story talked about, with faith the size of a mustard seed, this tiny amount, you can move mountains, Jesus says. The sermon or talk always seems to go to, and imagine what you could do with even more faith, right? And that to me seems to miss the point. That story is telling us that a small, tiny amount of faith is enough to move a mountain. Then what on earth do you need even any more for, right? It's like if we could just look at people and see a hint, a tiny bit of God in them, people who are our enemies, people who have hurt us, people who are different, other than us, in whatever tribal or ideological way you want. And yet we look and we find some small mark, a scar perhaps, a word that they say. We see a tiny something in them. The invitation is to put the fullness of Christ into them and see them as Jesus. After all, didn't Jesus tell us that when someone is thirsty or hungry or sick, they are Jesus? And it is them that we are saying no to or yes. It is Jesus we are saying no to or yes to. But to do that, we just need that small amount of faith. I mean, after all, how many times have we seen a mountain cast into the sea, right? That physically never happens, of course. But what is more monumental? What could be a more seismic shift than a person who previously saw someone as their enemy changing their mind about them? How often does that happen, where people go, you know what, I'm going to see Christ in that person, that coworker, this enemy of mine that Jesus says to love? When people actually do that, even in the absence of, outright evidence that they are Christ, because remember, that's not what the disciples were given. They didn't, I always thought if I were the resurrected Christ and I wanted people just to believe that I'd been resurrected, I would go around glowing or like hovering or something, just to make it clear this is divinity in front of you, but they aren't. They're given really a stranger, a shadow, something that could be there, but also couldn't be, and then just a little something to push them into reality. This is Christ. And that's that small, small mustard seed that causes a huge seismic shift, I think, in societies, in our workplaces, in our schools, anywhere we can think of. the one thing that will make a real change is if we are willing to look at each other and see Christ. Even when there's evidence to the contrary, perhaps. We've been told that they're wrong, that they're other, that they are beyond the pale, the wrong religion, have the wrong beliefs, whatever. And yet we say, no, what? That's Christ. If we can do that, the more of us that do that for each other, the more we christen one another. And guess what? Isn't that what Jesus said? Love each other. When he leaves, that's his commandment, love each other. And I think that's how you do that. I wonder, is faith not so much something to believe to be true in our heads, but is it a course of action we are invited to take? In this case, to christen our world, to recognize its holiness, its sacredness, to see that in our brother and sister, mother and father, and call it out in them, and to see the resurrected Christ here and now, just as the disciples saw the resurrected Christ then. This is the one gift that anyone in the world can give anyone else, which I find fascinating. Even a child can do this. In fact, children are good at it. They decide who they're, you can tell them that not to play with that child because they're wrong or for whatever reason, they won't listen because they just happen to see joy and fun in each other. And children are particularly good at it. Just thinking about faith as we come to a close, the great hall of faith, as it's called in Hebrews 11, you probably know the one, which talks about, it lists all these people who are wonderful ambassadors of faith. We are told that by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau. By faith, Rahab welcomed the spies from that story of Jericho. By faith, Moses' parents hid him from Moses. What's interesting about those stories is that if you go back and list all three of those again, you could also see, hold on a second, there was a sort of a murkiness there behind those actions. If we think about Isaac blessing Jacob and Esau, if you remember, that was a trick that Jacob played on Isaac to get Esau's blessing, wasn't it? And wasn't that done by Jacob's mother to try and, get ahead of Esau's blessing? And Rahab, wasn't she just trying to save her own skin? Wasn't she the prostitute who recognized that these Israelites were coming to destroy her city? And she knew that if she hid the spies, she would be spared. I mean, is that faith? What about Moses' parents hiding him? Did they do that because they weren't afraid of Pharaoh, or because they were, and they wanted to hide their child so that he wouldn't be killed? So if you want to, you can read those exact same stories and put a real human twist on them and say, actually, there's a lot of selfishness and murkiness and humanity behind those. But Hebrews 11 looks for the seed of faith. Just a tiny bit is all it needs. And then suddenly it expands that and bumps these people up into heroes of the faith, knowing that they are fully human and fallen and frail like all of us. But the stories just see a little bit of faith. And then that's what God does with us, finds the tiny bit of faith that is there and expands it to cover everything else. The same chapter says, all these people, Isaac, Rahab, Moses, his parents, all them that are listed, all these people were still living by faith when they died, right? They did not receive the full promise. They never were given the full picture. They only saw and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on the earth. Do you see that? You see how even these heroes of the faith admitted that they didn't see the full picture. They were miles away. They kind of saw something from a distance and grabbed onto it. And I think that's what happens in the post-resurrection stories. The disciples kind of see Christ in the distance there, in that conversation, in that voice, in that imagery, and they grab it. And the same invitation is given to us. Even if we only kind of see it and glimpse it in someone else, grab it, give it its fullness, make it larger than life, imbibe the presence of Christ into creation, into people, and let's look at the goodness that can spring up from that. This is, I think, possibly what it means to practice resurrection for us post-Easter. This is why it was better that Christ, or that Jesus, in flesh and blood Jesus, goes so that Christ can come. The very moment that the two disciples on the road to Emmaus recognize Jesus when Jesus breaks the bread, when they christen that stranger as Christ, that very moment, Jesus is taken from them. Isn't that fascinating? As soon as they recognize Jesus, he's gone. And now they're left with discovering Christ again. And it says they go and tell the story widely. It's like Jesus resists being put into one point in space and time, resists being an earthly king here, but not there, and instead goes into all the world, everywhere, invited to be called into the presence by those who want to follow and take up their own cross, and also discover Christ through all things, in all things, and in ourselves. This is what it means, I think, to be Christian, to be a fallen, frail, failing human being with lots of mistakes and problems like Rahab and Isaac and all the rest of them, but still to acknowledge that there's something there, just a small something, and to lean into that and say, there's Christ. I welcome the Christ in you. May you also welcome the Christ in me. That's how we change the world, I think. And I think that's what it means to practice resurrection. Not always easy, but the invitation is there. The road is not easy to walk. Jesus said, you'll have trouble doing this. It's going to be hard, but have no fear, for I've overcome the world. There's no fear of death at the end of this. It just goes on and on and on. The invitation is endless. And I'm going to finish there.
If I may, Neve asks, was it not a specific resurrected body Jesus had? If not, why the need for the ascension?
It's a good question. What does the ascension mean? One of the philosophical, theological questions around that is, where is Jesus' body now? You know, if we're talking about a physical ascension as in an earthly body that floated up through the stratosphere and goes into heaven, how does that fit with our notion of the place where God is and physicality around God? For me, I think that the ascension is that moment of really just leaving the disciples to get on with it. And the final pulling back of any physical presence of physically seeing Jesus, so as to avoid the temptation to, put Jesus somewhere and to create just a single place where Jesus is, and to encourage the disciples to disperse. In fact, the angel who appears and finds the disciples looking into the sky says, what are you doing? Why are you staring into space? Go and carry on with the mission. And so that's what we were left with. So in the sense of Jesus' physicality, the resurrected version of Jesus that the disciples meet, or that is talked about, that still has scars and yet is unrecognizable at the same time, it's not quite clear what's happened there. It seems to be something different from, say, for example, Lazarus coming back to life, who is still Lazarus. So yeah, the answer is it's not exactly clear what's going on there, but there is definitely an invitation to keep searching for Christ in the absence of that physical person right in front of us. Or I don't know, does anyone else have any thoughts on that? Go ahead, Michael. As sacred as the rest of us. It's not like the bad part of us that gets left behind. So there is something in that vision of the resurrection where actual flesh and blood is part of the whole redemption of all things. And yeah, it's a bit different from what I grew up with, which was, body and flesh bad, spiritual good, And yeah, you're right, James Allison, and I think a few others, even N.T. Wright points that out, that actually, which version of ourselves are we? Are we us at 30 or us at 60 or us at 12 or we're different, but somehow still celebrated as humans, and humanity is still part of the picture.
Stephen says, what about the linkage of Jesus's resurrected body to the resurrected body we look forward to?
Sorry, that was a question from Stephen. Stephen, do you want to say a bit more about that?
We like